Think forward. Think Research Channel.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stearns, and thank you all for coming. Today I'm going to take you on a little world tour, and I'm going to talk about the issue of childhood obesity, and more specifically about obesity in adolescence. So I'm going to take you on a little tour starting with Mali, where I did my doctoral research, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the research I did in France with Malian immigrants. And then we'll move to the research that I did in Nicaragua, and then on to Thailand, and then we'll come back to the United States, and I'll talk about some of the work that we're doing in some of the Washington, D.C. schools. So I thought I'd start off with a little entertaining slide that came from the Yale University School of Public Health. And this kind of defines some of my interest in nutrition, because I have this combination, the degree that I have is in nutrition as well as in anthropology. And when I got into anthropology, I was really interested in cultural eating behaviors and so forth, but also the sort of physical nature of human beings and our human adaptation and our plasticity regarding human growth and development. And of course, some of you have heard about the thrifty gene hypothesis. There are some researchers who suggest that perhaps humans have adapted over a period of time to store more efficiently body fat. And there are some populations in the world that may better, more efficiently store body fat than other populations. So that kind of brings us all to a whole. I wanted to then show you just initially this slide, and I know you cannot read these numbers. They're tiny little numbers up there. But this slide actually comes from the National Geographic Association, and it was from an article that came out in 2004 looking at obesity from a global perspective. And what's highlighted are countries in yellow basically represent countries where the prevalence of obesity is greater than 24%. So we'll just look at the highest rates right now. And so in the first globe, we're seeing North America, South America, and as you expect, the United States is up there, but also Mexico. And a few countries are gaining the numbers of people who are obese and overweight. And then the second globe shows some information regarding North Africa, the Middle East, Egypt, and South Africa. We're beginning to see climbing rates of obesity. And then over on the third globe, you see regions like Russia and Thailand, which is one of the regions I'm going to talk about today, where the prevalence of obesity is climbing. The greatest prevalence of obesity in the world is actually in Polynesia, and those tiny little islands on the far right side include some of those regions of the world. So you can sort of see highlighted in light yellow where there are high areas, of obesity. Now, I wanted to give a few definitions, and I know some of you are very familiar with how obesity and overweight is defined, but that map that I just showed you, the data that were collected to make the kinds of comparisons between country to country is using body mass index data. And of course, these are data that were actually collected from adult populations. And when we look at adults, we actually define obesity in terms of body mass index. And so overweight, we define it as basically a BMI that's between 25 and 30, and I'll give you that definition in a minute. And for obesity, we're looking at this number of 30. So what makes up body mass index, but basically weight and height. And so the formula is this second bullet listed here, which is weight divided by height squared, and that's in using kilograms and meters. And so just that's something to think about. There are many limitations regarding the measurement of body mass index because it just uses height and weight. And we know that height can be influenced by genetics. We know that weight can be influenced by overall skeletal mass as well as lean muscle mass and so forth. In children, just using these sort of magic numbers of 25 and 30, those numbers aren't quite appropriate. We have to use another measurement, and so we actually compare body mass index for age to reference populations. And so I'll talk about that in a second. But again, going back to the BMI and where do we get some of those numbers come from population data. And when we look at this graph, it shows that we're looking at the risk of mortality, basically, plotted with body mass index. And as you can see, there's a lower risk really on the left side, but sort of in the center. If you have a body mass index that's lower than about 19, your risk for diseases that are associated with being underweight increases, and as that body mass number increases over 25 and then again over 30, the risk for mortality increases. So just understand that that BMI value is based on population data. So when you go to your health practitioner and you find out your BMI is 26, don't be, I mean, it's important to know that, and you need to get other kinds of tests to look for risk of diseases that are associated with obesity, like heart disease and diabetes type 2. But just because you have that value doesn't mean an individual is necessarily going to get a certain illness. Of course, this is a chart. Some of you may have seen similar charts. If you have children, you may look at some of these growth charts. And the Centers for Disease Control has growth charts that are out there that look at height for age and weight for age. And this is a growth chart that shows body mass index for age. And this is really what researchers are using. When you see data that compares Mississippi with Tennessee, with Virginia, and they're comparing the prevalence of obesity in various states in the United States and even throughout the world, they're typically comparing body mass index for age, and they're looking at the prevalence of those children who are at a high-risk percentile. And when we look at, I have my little pointer here, we look at some of the percentiles. I know you can't really see the numbers very well here, but basically if you're looking at the 50th percentile, that would represent the mean of the US population. So when we look at risk for obesity and underweight and overweight, we're actually looking at these percentile values, so that children who are below the 5th percentile are typically classified as being underweight, and those children who come between the 85th to 95th percentile are typically classified as overweight, and then above the 95th percentile as obese. So when this is one of the simpler ways that we can make comparisons between populations. There are many other methods that we use, though, to determine obesity in an individual and within a population. And some of you may have heard about the whole issue of abdominal fat and how that increases our risk for heart disease and diabetes and so forth. And one way that we can look at risk for abdominal fat is to actually take a measurement of waist-hip circumference measurement, or just looking at overall waist circumference measurements. And in children, we've seen that those who have a large waist circumference on the larger, as far as comparing to a reference population, those children tend to have a greater risk for developing diseases that are related to obesity. And one kind of syndrome is called metabolic syndrome, which we see in association with obesity, and basically is looking at a multitude of factors like risk for diabetes type 2, looking at high cholesterol levels and so forth. And so the larger the waist circumference, therefore the larger the amount of abdominal fat. Some people here may hear about sort of apple-shaped versus pear-shaped, and sort of the apple-shaped individual has a greater risk for heart disease. And it's not just the case in adults, it's also the case for children as well. I'm not going to read you these numbers, but this is just a chart to show you that you can get your waist circumference measurement taken and you can compare it to reference values, and you can get an idea where your risk is. Another measurement that can be taken to measure obesity, overweight, risk for some of the chronic illnesses associated with obesity, is looking at lean muscle, percentage of lean muscle, or basically percentage of body fat. And I'm taking some skin fold measurements here, which is one way to do it. There are other kinds of measurements like bioelectrical impedance and so forth. Some researchers argue that there's actually a better predictor. These kinds of measurements looking at body composition are better than using body mass index because of the variability with weight. Okay, I thought I also had to give just a little bit of an overview regarding some of the latest theories about the causes of obesity. And typically we divide them into genetic and environmental influences. And I already mentioned this idea of the thrifty gene hypothesis, the idea that there are some populations out there who may be better adapted to storing fat more efficiently. Here in the United States, the Pima Indians in southwestern part of the United States basically have the highest prevalence of obesity as well as diabetes type 2. And it's thought that many scientists have suggested that perhaps this may be due to this thrifty gene hypothesis. The thrifty gene may also be influenced by other kinds of biological factors like fat cell numbers. We know that individuals, when we're born, we all have a certain number of fat cells. As we get older, and if we tend to gain weight, those fat cells can expand up to about 20 times their size, and then they can divide. And when that happens, we may actually generate more of this enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, and we seem to find that individuals who have more of that enzyme tend to their cells tend to crave more fat, and there may be a relationship with hunger cues and so forth. And speaking of hunger cues, there's been some latest recent research looking at various hormones that influence satiety or a feeling of fullness. And some of you may have heard about PYY. I think that was a hormone that was looked at, or a protein looked at more recently, and where there was a group of adults who were sort of let loose at a buffet, an Indian buffet in England, and those who were given PYY basically ate 30% fewer calories than those who did not. And there's a lot of genetic research that's being looked at regarding some of these proteins and their influence on hunger, satiety, and so forth. Moving on to some of the environmental influences, I think many of us are familiar here in the United States with the issue of portion distortion, the idea that in the United States and throughout the world, we're beginning to see the standard portion sizes growing quite rapidly. We know that during childhood, many children up to about the age of 3 are pretty good at self-regulating their intake. And after 3, we find that they begin to sort of look around and begin to recognize what other people are eating and are much more influenced by what they see rather than their hunger cues, what they feel. And of course, we know just from some of our own experiences about the sizes of portions at fast food restaurants and at general restaurants, and even looking at plates. If you look at your grandparents' plates, they're much smaller than maybe the plates you have in your own household. And then, of course, physical activity. We see data regarding individuals who don't sleep well. There's a greater risk of obesity. We also see some interesting data, which kind of links with global warming. Had to throw that that in there, but areas in which there are a greater number of air conditioners, and even where there are greater temperature extremes. People tend to be more sedentary, stay indoors, and tend to have there tends to be a greater risk of obesity. Also, a decline in breastfeeding. We know that among children who were breastfed, they tend to have, there's a lower risk of them becoming obese later on, and as well as developing certain illnesses associated with obesity, like diabetes type 2. Also in many countries throughout the world where we see economic improvement, individuals are sort of moving away from breastfeeding. I know in Thailand, formula was thought to be basically a status symbol. So if you gained a little more money and you could afford formula, people would use that. They would prefer that over breastfeeding. And we know that that may not necessarily be such a good thing in many other ways. And of course, greater reliance with technology has an impact as well. So I'm going to start out with a little bit with my research in Mali. And Mali is located in West Africa. And if you've ever heard of the town Timbuktu, well, Timbuktu is in Mali, in the northern part of Mali. So I hear my daughter out there. But Ségou is the region where I did this research, and I was there in, which is a rural sort of region. However, Ségou is one of the third largest cities in Mali, and I was also in 4 villages. But Mali in general has a pretty low population density, and there's a lot of land, and most people live along the river. So I stayed pretty much along villages along the river. I'm doing a weight measurement just basically on a simple bathroom scale. That was the kind of equipment that was easy to carry around, easy to calibrate, and so forth. And you may notice it's a little dark in the background. And the reason is because when I took the measurements, I had to collect the data at about 11 o'clock at night, very late, because the girls throughout sub-Saharan Africa, girls are working constantly. They have a lot of responsibilities, and I found that that really influences their nutritional status. And unfortunately, these young girls had to work out in the fields, and they were doing some harvesting, and they couldn't come back to participate in my study until they had finished. So they came really late at night, and we had to use lanterns and all kinds of fun stuff, no electricity, to take these measurements in Mali. So here's some of the data, and I know it looks kind of scary, I guess, at first, but something to recognize. I first wanted to show you not the BMI. Most of the rest of the data, I'm really going to show you BMI for age, just so we can make better comparisons from sort of country to country. But these data are showing you arm fat area, which gives an indication of overall body fat. And what we're doing is I'm going to compare these data with a reference population. And remember, I mentioned that 50th percentile on that CDC chart represents the mean of the U.S. population. Well, on this chart, 0 represents that mean. And so these girls, both in the rural and in the urban regions, are significantly low. So, I mean, really in general, there was no evidence whatsoever of obesity in Mali. And it didn't surprise me. Mali is extremely poor. The mean income is about $280 per person per year. And this is just also re-emphasizing that. This is the body mass index for age. So this is the percentiles, and these are the age. And you'll see a little bit of a decline here because when we compare with U.S. girls are having their growth spurt at this time. So this curve is kind of going down as girls in the U.S. are kind of climbing, so that's why it really decreases. But again, really no evidence for obesity. And some of the major reasons, I have to talk about this first, is sort of the one extreme setting, relate to high energy expenditure, which I mentioned before, family size, and cultural eating patterns. I'm working with a biostatistician over in the Department of Health Administration and Policy, Yota Kidsantis, and we're doing some statistical analyses using classification trees. And some of the data that I collected in Mali was not just anthropometric data and physical measurements regarding nutritional status, but I collected a lot of data regarding environmental variables, wealth variables, and I looked at information like, did the girls go to school, what kinds of workloads did they do, how much was there an income that was coming into the household, were there servants in the family, did the girls go to school, did they not go to school, and so forth. And from all of these variables, the variable that most greatly predicted if a girl was undernourished or not was actually these high energy demands. And this is a young girl who's about 10 years old who is pounding millet. And what she is doing is basically processing a grain. Unfortunately, in Mali, there's no stores to kind of go out and purchase, your prepared, Rice Krispies and so forth. The girls have to go out into the fields, grow the millet and the grains and so forth, and process it. And it takes a lot of energy, and they have to do this 3 times a day. So significant energy expenditure contributed to undernutrition, even beyond some of the other factors. Secondly came this issue of family structure, and that when, of course, as you might expect, if there's a larger family, particularly a larger number of girls, there is a greater competition for resources. So girls, if there were greater numbers of girls in the family and a greater number of family members, there was a greater risk of being undernourished. One thing that's kind of striking, I think, from this slide, just to show you, is that you look at some of the adults and you look at this tiny little baby who's 6 months old and unfortunately is suffering from kwashiorkor, and you see a huge contrast regarding the size of the adults and the size of the children. And part of that is thought to be due to cultural eating patterns, and the idea that as a child ages, they basically gain greater access to food. First of all, there is a lot of respect that's given to elders in Mali. And the older you are, the greater access you have to high nutrient quality food, including meats and some of the fruits and vegetables. These are 2 women, adult women, who are eating at a wedding, and so they're actually sitting in a chair. Typically, people eat sitting on the floor, and the women eat separately from the men, and they eat with their hand out of a common pot, and this is basically a kind of grain with a little bit of a sauce. And as you can see, because the girls all eat together, if there's a greater number of girls, there's most likely greater competition for those foods and for the nutrient-dense foods. So I found that to be an influence as well. And while I was in Mali, I began to hear about this sort of mysterious disease called diabetes type 2. Obviously didn't affect these young girls in this population, but it did seem to be affecting older males, and particularly in the capital city of Bamako. And we worked with some men who were diagnosed with diabetes type 2 and would have to go on a sort of weekly basis, daily basis, depending on the severity, to get medication and so forth. And they didn't know much about this disease, but they knew that it was coming to Mali. I did a little bit of research later and found that a lot of people were blaming this new disease to be on the influence from foods that were coming from surrounding countries, mainly Côte d'Ivoire, which is a much wealthier country. And Côte d'Ivoire was blamed on introducing fast food. And in fast food in Mali, no McDonald's. McDonald's is, I think, maybe one of the few countries in the world that has no McDonald's and no KFC and so forth. But they do have a lot of street vendors who sell fried plantains and French fries and those kinds of things. So with this interest in the issue of obesity beginning to rise in Mali, I was actually kind of interested in what was happening with young girls who might have been raised in an improved environment. And part of this also came from some research out there looking at immigrant populations in the United States. We see that obesity is rising among immigrant populations. Well, where could I find an immigrant group of Malians, or at least Malians who were sort of born in an improved environment, whose parents were born in Mali? Well, I couldn't find that in the United States, so I had to go to France. So I had some nice funding from the Provost's office, and I got to go to France for a summer. However, I didn't get to live in central Paris. I got to stay in some of the surrounding sort of northern suburbs, Mantes-la-Jolie, Saint-Denis, not the central Saint-Denis island, but north, as well as Montfermeil. Montfermeil, and these particular suburbs are where many immigrant populations live. There's a lot of assisted or housing regions that are provided by the government and so forth. Even though the individuals are poor, they're given access to health care. Many of them are working. They have food on a daily basis that's ready and so forth. There's the water is clean, so there's all kinds of factors. I went and found a population of young girls who were Malian, or actually they were born in Paris, but there was a lot of sort of inclusion criteria for this sample. The girls had to be between the ages of 10 to 17. They had to have parents who were born in Mali. Their parents had to be of Bambara Fulani descent. So I was struggling trying to find several of these girls, and a lot of people were afraid to be involved in my study because they were worried about their sort of legal visas or immigration status, basically. They were afraid that I was going to go tell somebody if they weren't there legally. But I was able to actually find some girls. I had to go door to door. I had to hire Malians to sort of help me find individuals. And what I did find was really pretty interesting. I know, again, here's a really fun graph that you like to look at, but this red line represents that 50th percentile, the American mean. And what the pink line is basically the Parisian Malian girls. And what I found is when I looked at the growth data for BMI, for age, I found that they followed that 50th percentile very well. On one point, I felt relieved that because I was using this U.S. reference population, and I thought, gosh, I wonder if that's really that appropriate when I'm trying to figure out if the girls are growing well or not. But because the sample sort of followed that, it made me think that perhaps using that reference population was okay, if this environment was truly improved. But what I did not find was any strong evidence of obesity. I really expected to see some because of the data among other immigrant populations. And in France, when you look at the West African populations, you don't see a high prevalence of obesity, but where you do see obesity to be high in France is among North African populations, those from Algeria and Tunisia and so forth. Of course, I thought that, well, this overall improved growth compared to what I found in Mali was most likely due to an improved environment. Of course, I'd love to go back and look at this in greater detail. I mentioned improved environment. Patisserie is not necessarily, a little bit to the extreme, but the girls basically have access to fortified kinds of foods. They also obviously have access to clean water. They have access to a good healthcare system where they didn't so much in Mali. One issue, again, is also transportation. In Mali, this is not a picture from Paris, this is in Mali, and this is just showing a car that we had to purchase there. And unfortunately, when you are working in the villages in Mali, you need to either purchase a car or you sit in a village for about a week because the transportation system is very slow. It also is affected by the weather. The rainy season, for example, can make your car stuck in the mud, and you got to wait for a bunch of people to come and help pick up the car and take it out of the mud. But of course, in Paris, the public transportation system is excellent, and girls are still walking, so we don't necessarily see significant rates of obesity. They're eating traditional Malian foods. They are able to go to markets on a daily basis, where in Mali, the access to food is much more limited. Again, there's not that prepared foods. Where in France, the prepared foods are ready. They have access to traditional foods as well as they have access to fortified kinds of foods and to these markets on a daily basis. Interviewing the girls, I found that they were eating traditional foods. Their parents were cooking these foods, and they were eating there was some assimilation in that they were eating a baguette and maybe a salad, but were not influenced by the McDos and the Le Quics that have invaded France regarding some of the fast food restaurants. So some of these changes that were occurring regarding undernutrition to overnutrition got me interested in this whole issue of the nutrition transition. And nutritionists are looking at this from a global basis. And how that's defined is population shifts in dietary patterns considered to increase the risks of obesity and chronic disease. And it's driven by demographic changes in population, urbanization, and changes in dietary trends from food production and marketing. And just as a little joke, on an aside, I had my own sort of experience somewhat with a nutrition transition. This is my husband and my dog that we found in Mali. And I'm not going to show you a later slide of my husband, but I'm going to show you a later slide of my dog. And that my dog was greatly influenced by the nutrition transition. We brought him back to the United States from Mali, and unfortunately, with all of the great food that he found, he wasn't eating bones and sort of scraps. He was eating Purina dog food and maybe a few scraps from our table as well. So, you know, we're not, you know, it's not just humans that are immune to this whole issue of obesity, but of course we know our pets are beginning to become at risk for obesity as well. Okay, so then moving on to Nicaragua, the whole idea of the nutrition transition really was first not sort of discovered, or a lot of epidemiologists started noticing this in South America, Central America. And I had the opportunity through the College of Health and Human Services with the School of Nursing to go with some students, nursing students who were doing a technical exchange program, to go to Nicaragua and assist with some nutritional assessments. And because I had this interest in adolescent nutrition, I decided that it would be interesting to do some research and collect some data in one of the barrios in the town of Managua, where the nursing students had worked, and that's the capital of Nicaragua. The particular barrio was basically, when I first got there, it had been established about 10 years prior to when I was there, and the barrio consisted of individuals who had moved there from surrounding rural areas, and they had moved there because of political problems, because of natural disasters and so forth. But what I did find was very comparable to what has been found in other regions of Central America. This kind of study had not been done before among adolescents in Nicaragua. So this is some of the first data that had been collected among this particular population. And so I did see really this sort of issue of underweight as well as overweight and obesity. I did expect it. Regarding the nutrition transition in South America and in Central America, there are some interesting issues regarding gender and that and poverty in that poor regions of Nicaragua and through other countries in Central America. You see obesity, the prevalence of obesity being greater in females and women than you do among men. But in the wealthier regions, you see obesity, the prevalence being greater in men than in women. Okay, this is again showing you that sort of BMI for age, and again this is the 50th percentile right here, and so we're seeing a trend where it kind of moves a little bit around because of the change during the adolescent growth spurt, but you do see this not sort of staying specifically right at that 50th percentile, but basically being below as well. So showing you, this sort of mix of undernutrition and overnutrition. One other point I thought it would be interesting to show you regarding one of the limitations of BMI involves this issue of the genetic potential for height. And so I thought I would just show you a couple of graphs showing this height for age z-score, which is in blue, and the weight for age z-score, which is in purple. And you'll note that the height for age is much lower than the weight. And there is some evidence suggesting that certain populations throughout Central America may have a shorter genetic potential for height compared to the U.S. sort of reference population. And if you think about that formula, the BMI, which looks at weight divided by height, and if height is basically shorter, that's going to bring that BMI value up to a larger number. And so we may actually think that there's a larger number of girls who are overweight because of that issue. However, I went back and I actually compared the data with some other reference data, looked at overall body composition and so forth, and still found this issue of there being overweight and underweight in this particular population. Regarding the specific barrio, we also noted that not only among the girls who are overweight and underweight is there an issue of too many calories and too few calories, but there are also issues of young girls not being able to consume enough micronutrients. And we even looked at some evidence of iron deficiency anemia, looking at hemoglobin values, which we still think may be influenced also by parasites. However, we do know that there, most likely from the environment, there is a great risk that these girls may be at risk of micronutrient deficiencies. And if you look here, these are a couple of pictures of some of the areas, sort of markets where the girls have access to food. This is a small mini market which is found within the barrio, and the barrio does not have paved roads. Basically, it's a large number of homes that are sort of clustered together. And when girls and families need to go and purchase food, they typically go to stores that are very close and easily accessed, just like we may. And so they'll go to these small, sort of what they're called pulperias. As you can see, they're very sparse. There's not much food there. And most of the food is stuff that's going to last a long time. Some of these little stores even may have electricity and may have refrigerators, but they contain typically Coca-Cola and sweetened fruit drinks. There's some eggs here, but basically you've got some chips and so forth. This woman here is preparing tortillas, and this is her job, and she basically prepares tortillas and sells the tortillas with some white cheese, which is as far as cheese goes, fairly lean and healthy, but if that's your entire diet, it's going to be high in calories, higher in fat, and definitely low in micronutrients. So the access to these, a variety of food and to micronutrients is quite low. And we see this throughout the world, that where this nutrition transition is occurring in poor regions of the world, people are gaining a significant amount of weight. The risk for chronic illnesses of diabetes and heart disease is increasing, yet they're also at risk for micronutrient deficiencies. And we know certain micronutrients, like the B vitamins, may help prevent heart disease. So that can create even greater problems. So moving on to Thailand, that was the sort of latest research that I've done, excluding the work that we're doing here in the United States. I received some funding from the Center for Global Studies and then a Fulbright grant to go to Thailand. And I was very interested in what was happening in Thailand. Thailand has gone through some tremendous economic transitions, and the economy has improved dramatically in the past 10 to 12 years. And I was very interested in what was happening among the adolescent population regarding nutritional status. The only other research that had been done on the adolescent population in Thailand had been done in northern Thailand, where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of severe undernutrition. And there really hadn't been anything done in rural and sort of suburban regions. So I went there and I basically found the same kind of data that I did in Nicaragua. However, these girls are basically middle-class girls, and so I found underweight, I found overweight, and I found obesity. And so in this particular region, which has a much improved economy compared to Nicaragua, I saw both. However, a lot of people sort of anecdotally were very surprised that I was going to Nicaragua, to Thailand, to look at obesity, because many of us sort of have this picture in our mind of a typical Thai who is very thin and petite and so forth. And I think throughout Thailand there's been some research, particularly research related to body image, that has shown that particularly girls, not so much in the male population, but girls who are thinner and sort of have this petite overall frame tend to have greater access to or tend to have a greater social status, and they may have better opportunities in getting jobs and so forth, unfortunately. So with that, I looked at some of the BMI for age data, and I actually had boys and girls. I collected information on boys as well, but I thought just for comparison's sake, I was just going to talk about girls this evening. But one of the things that I found that was very interesting in the girls is that I found that when we look at the BMI for age, from girls aged 11 to 18, their BMI, there are more girls who are obese at age 11 and 12, and as they get older, basically the BMI values decrease, and there was definitely a significant correlation there. And so basically, in general, as they get older, the girls are getting thinner. And at first I thought, well, maybe this has something to do with this sort of economic transition. And when I interviewed older girls, it was interesting because they seemed to be eating more like their parents and the traditional Thai foods. And some of the younger girls tended to be eating more of the fast food restaurants that have sort of invaded Thailand in just the past really sort of 5 to 10 years. But I also thought perhaps this may have something to do with the influence of body image and this whole issue of social status. And I didn't see it so much in the boys. There wasn't a correlation in the boys. So I think I'd like to go back and take a look a little more at that. Just to show you a few slides from Thailand to see this issue of the economic transition, one of the things that has arisen in Thailand regards there are, of course, a number of large shopping malls, shopping malls with escalators and arcades and so forth that have definitely invaded Thailand. And you see a lot of young children going to these places, and that's what they're enjoying. And the parents are much more willing to sort of drop their kids off because they feel it's safer. There's a lot of cars on the road, there's a lot of pollution, it's very hot in Thailand. More people have air conditioners than they used to have, so more people are staying indoors. They're becoming accustomed to this cooler climate and so forth. And so I think that a lot of these issues that are impacted by the economic transition do affect obesity, and it definitely is rising. And this is sort of showing the whole issue of public transportation is much more readily available, and children and girls are taking that, and they're being driven everywhere. There used to be mopeds and bicycles all throughout Thailand, particularly in Bangkok and the suburban areas, but now they're replaced by cars, and everyone's using cars. Every family has two cars. Well, this is a slide showing an intervention that's being done, and it seems to be successful in Singapore, actually, but this is taken in Thailand, and Thailand is sort of using Singapore as an example of what can be done. Singapore has a very high prevalence of heart disease and diabetes, and Singapore is using some very strict measures to go about and sort of rid the country of obesity and overweight, and they're basically going into their schools and creating wellness programs, and they're basically segregating children who are obese and those who are not. And obviously this would not work here in the United States. Thailand has taken not such a strict approach, but is basically going into schools, and schools that develop wellness programs, they're giving some funding to and so forth. And this is a picture of a 12-year-old boy way up there who's teaching an aerobics class in one of the sort of exemplary wellness schools in Thailand, and all the kids are out there sort of doing aerobics. So this seems to be, partially effective. We may see sort of later on. So for one of the concluding slides, I'm getting fairly close here, but I thought I'd throw all of the sort of 3 countries here, Nicaragua, Mali, and Thailand. And this yellow line is that Malian data. So you can see that there is this significant difference between the Thai data and the Nicaraguan data versus this Malian data, where I really didn't see any evidence of obesity. Now I did that research in Mali in '96 and '97, so it is 10 years later, and it might be interesting to go back and see if that has changed. Some recent demographic health survey data have shown that there is some increases in the capital, Bamako. So, I have to, answer, is obesity, particularly among children, a global epidemic? Well, one of the limitations is that we just don't have enough comparative data from this BMI for age, and there's a lot of controversy as to, which reference population should you use and so forth to really, I think, thoroughly examine it. And also, but we do know from the adult data that it's definitely an issue. And I think I've definitely shown from some of the examples in my research that it does exist, and we're seeing, unfortunately, a problem of overnutrition and undernutrition. And how do we intervene when we've got both those kinds of situations? In Nicaragua, we've been doing a nutrition intervention, and it's taken about 4 years to really see any impact. And so we know that education programs can be effective. It just takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of continued effort. This slide is just showing you where the United States lies compared to 30 other countries in the world. And you thought we'd be right up here, but we're not, actually. We are about number 19 here. And first is Tonga, then Samoa. We see several countries, including Qatar within the Middle East, and Polynesia and so forth, as well as South America. But the United States is not necessarily first, as we might expect, but there's definitely a problem, and it's definitely growing. And we see it most likely from some of the slim evidence that it's growing more quickly in children than in many other countries. A little bit from a historical perspective, although this is from 1999, but we definitely see this huge trend in children and adolescents of increasing overweight and obesity. Okay, and then sort of moving back, again, we know that obesity exists among children and adolescents in the United States. So I'm not sure if it's really worth going in there and doing some major baseline studies, but we need to collect some of that data because we need to find out what kinds of interventions will work and what will be effective and how can we make a change. And so our principal investigator, Dr. Jean Moore, who is in the School of Nursing, is assisting a group of researchers go into a couple of schools where we found obesity rates to be quite high in the Washington, D.C. public schools. And we are going to, we've actually initiated an intervention, and we're going to look at the effectiveness of this intervention. And this is one of the schools is actually considered a sort of exemplary school from one of Bush's policies, and not a slight on Bush, but hey, unfortunately, from some of these No Child Left Behind policies, a lot of schools have left behind nutrition education, and they've left behind physical activity and so forth. And so a challenge is, well, how do we get into these schools and implement some of these programs without affecting those kinds of other curriculum emphasis that's being done in the schools. There's been some programs that have been quite effective, ridding schools of vending machines and so forth, but we're going into the schools and we're looking at what's happening. We're looking at blood pressure. We're looking at heights and weights. Some of these children have high blood pressure. Some of them have diabetes type 2 as young as age 9 and 10, and so there is definitely a need for some kind of intervention. We're doing some education using the food guide pyramid. The food guide pyramid is available online, and these children that we're working with have the access to this particular online program, www.mypyramid.gov, at school. Some of them have access outside of school as well, but we're teaching using some of the children's recommendations that are given from this particular pyramid. We're talking about activity. We're giving the children pedometers, and we're hoping to improve their knowledge and behavior as well as overall nutritional status. So we just finished collecting that data. We've done some interventions, and I am we're still doing some analysis and data entry, so we'll get back to you later on what kinds of things are effective. And we hope we can develop an intervention that we can implement with other schools throughout the United States. Okay, so I'm getting pretty close to the end here, and I wanted to just sort of lastly, I touched upon some of the research that I've done looking at the nutritional status among adolescents in various populations in the world, but I wanted to leave you all with just some general recommendations and what can we do regarding children. And the first issue regards breastfeeding. Again, I mentioned that risk can be decreased increased, and we need to encourage moms to breastfeed, as well as encourage our policymakers to allow for environments that will allow mothers to breastfeed freely. Recognizing appropriate portion sizes for children is important. I mean, recognizing that a fact that when you look at a deck of cards, that actually is 3 ounces of meat and may represent a serving size, not sort of the typical serving size when you go to a certain steakhouse down the road where it's maybe 12 ounces. A couple studies have looked at the issue of deprivation, and looking at deprivation may actually lead to an increase in the consumption of calories. So we don't want to encourage children to eat high-calorie foods, but we also don't want to necessarily completely deprive them, because we find that they'll go after additional amounts. Now, think about some of these recommendations, and obviously there are cultural limitations to many of these recommendations. Perhaps breastfeeding promotion can occur in multiple regions of the world, but the whole issue of portion sizes may be another story. Monitoring growth and development. Unfortunately, a lot of health practitioners don't have significant training, or they might have not the appropriate kinds of scales, and haven't been able to practice techniques for growth and development. And it seems fairly simple, and parents can actually do this on their own. But unfortunately, when you go to a different health practitioner each time, taking your child into for each visit, they might be at the 80th percentile, then they may be at the 50th percentile, and people typically just sort of attribute that to poor measurement error, basically. And we need to take those measurements seriously and hope that there's better accuracy and reliability in that. Increasing consumption of fruits and vegetables. We see multiple studies showing that people who eat more fruits and vegetables have a lower risk of developing cancers and other chronic illnesses. And throughout Nicaragua, we see, and Mali, just this monotonous diet that's very low. There's not a lot of variety, and it's very low regarding fruits and vegetables. And here in the United States, we see that as well. Juice and milk consumption. We saw this as an issue in Nicaragua with the high consumption of sweet fruit drinks, which would influence high caloric intake. But here in the United States, we know that children are drinking much more juice. Parents may think that it's very healthy because it has added micronutrients, but the calories add up, of course. And then the whole issue of limiting television, lifestyle activities. We know about activity and encouraging children to be more active and to model those behaviors as well by walking and taking the stairs and so forth. Several studies looking at eating together as a family, as well as eating at home. People who eat out at restaurants tend to eat about 200 calories more each time they eat at a restaurant. And then again, going back to the school, many children, particularly in the study that we're working with, eat a significant portion of their calories in school. They'll eat breakfast often, and they eat lunch. And so understanding what's happening in schools can have a major impact. Okay. Then I'm at my acknowledgments. So lastly, I just wanted to thank so many people. I have lots of students and funding opportunities that allowed me to do these different kinds of research programs. And I appreciate your attention in listening to all of this research. And there's lastly, you may have heard my little daughter out there, but she went to Thailand with me while I was there with a Fulbright. So thank you. And I guess we're going to take some questions.